absolutely sure?
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Pushing me back there.
Oh. You're welcome. No one's ever bothered on your feet since. It was years ago. Come to think of it, that was the first time I met a puka. I don't know what it was called then, but there was this little guy who showed me how to puka.
That is one big fish.
I called it on the head.
Help, Boo-Boo! Boo-Boo!
Help!
Brains. But the truth is, I spent my life wandering this lake. Metaphor's too strong for a single boo-boo, but not for a triple boo-boo. Form megafish!
Megafish?
Megafish, right. Lock fins and swim together. Megafish! Like you. Oh, Ali, you do that for me? Wow.
Welcome back to the Film Box, and if this is your first time here, welcome. Pull up a seat. We do things a little differently here. We don't just tell you what happened in a film, we open it up. We go inside. We find the things that were hiding just beneath the surface, the decisions nobody talked about, the moments that change meaning the second you know what to look for. Every film is a box, and tonight we are cracking one open together. The film we are looking at today is one that arrived quietly, almost by accident, slipping onto Netflix on the first day of May 2026. No massive theatrical campaign, no awards bus chasing it down the red carpet. Just a film, a warm, visually stunning, sometimes frustrating animated film, sitting there on your screen, waiting. And here's the thing about that kind of release. Sometimes those are the ones that surprise you. And sometimes they're the ones that make you ask hard questions about what a film was trying to be versus what it actually became. Today, we are asking both. We are talking about Swapped. Now, before we go anywhere near the story, before I tell you a single thing about what happens in this film, I want to do something we always do here at the Film Box. I want to open the box from the outside first. Because knowing how this film was made, why it exists, and what it went through to get to your screen will completely change how you feel watching it. Trust me on this, the production history of Swapped is one of the more quietly fascinating stories in recent animation, and it starts not in 2026 but almost a decade earlier. So let's go behind the lens first, because that's where it gets interesting. Cast your mind back to February 28. A director named Nathan Greno signs a multi-year deal with Skydance Media. You might know Greno's name from one particular film, Tangled, the 2010 Disney animated musical that is, by many accounts, one of the studio's most emotionally complete works of that era. Tangled had warmth, wit, genuine stakes, and a visual poetry to it that still holds up. So when Greno signs with Skydance and begins developing what was then reportedly called Powerless, the question in animation circles was, what does this director have in him beyond Disney? What does he make when nobody is looking over his shoulder and the brand identity isn't riding on every frame? That question is what makes Swap such a fascinating case study, because it took 8 years to answer it. Here's the first production detail that changes how you see this film. The project wasn't always called Swapped. It wasn't always called Pukuiter, though that became its working title for years. It started as Powerless, and reportedly, according to behind the scenes accounts, that original title carried a very specific thematic intention. The story was always, at its core, about what happens when you strip away everything familiar from a creature, its body, its identity, its place in the world, and force it to survive with nothing it recognizes: power, in the sudden absence of it. The title changed. The theme never did. And when you watch Swapped with that in mind, when you understand that the body swap isn't just a comedic device, but is the entire philosophical engine of the story, those early scenes hit very differently. The second thing you need to know before we open this film is about the platform situation, because it shapes everything about how Swapped was built. This film was originally developed for Apple TV Plus. That's where Skydance Animation was housed. And then, in October 2023, Netflix entered the picture with a new multi-year deal that absorbed the Skydance Animation library, including Puku, as it was still called at that point. The transition reportedly shifted the film's intended release from 2025 to 2026. Now here's why that matters to you as a viewer. Apple TV Plus animated originals tend to be quieter, more contemplative in their pacing, built for a subscriber base that has chosen to seek them out. Netflix animated originals are built differently. They have to perform on a massive scroll-through platform where the thumbnail has to grab you, and the first 10 minutes have to hold you. Whether intentional or not, this platform shift likely influenced the final shape of Swapped. Its busier pacing, its reliance on visual spectacle in the opening act, the way it moves through its world at a speed that sometimes doesn't let the world breathe. When you feel the film rushing, remember it wasn't always destined to live on this platform. It was built for somewhere quieter and then had to learn to speak louder. The third production detail is about a composer, and this one is genuinely interesting. Siddhartha Khosla was brought on board to score Swapped, reportedly confirmed back in October 2023 at the same time the Netflix deal was announced. Khosla is best known for his work in television. His score for This Is Us is one of the most emotionally precise pieces of compositional work in recent American TV. What he was being asked to do with Swapped was something very different. build a soundscape for a fully invented world, for creatures that don't exist, in a landscape that has no real world reference point. And when you listen carefully to Swap's score, the way certain motifs shift and mirror each other when Ollie and Ivy swap bodies, the way the world's music feels simultaneously ancient and alien, you start to hear what that challenge produced. The score is one of the film's most underappreciated achievements. We'll come back to it. The fourth thing that changes how you see this film is the world design itself. And this is where Skydance Animation did something genuinely bold. Every creature in the valley, the film's fictional world, is constructed from organic matter: wood, bark, roots, foliage. The otter-like pukus appear to be carved from the forest floor itself. The javans, the bird-like creatures, look as though they were assembled from branches and feathers in strange, pale timber. The review community noted this too, with one observer writing that the animals appear to be carved of bark or tree, as if the genesis for creation was rooted in underbrush. What's remarkable about this design philosophy is that it makes every character a literal piece of the environment. These aren't animals who live in a world, they are the world. And when the villain threatens to destroy the valley, it becomes viscerally clear that destroying the land means destroying every living thing on it, because they are made of it. The stakes are embedded in the design itself. That is extraordinary conceptual storytelling, and most people watching Swapped will never consciously notice it. But they'll feel it. That's the mark of world building done right. The fifth piece of the puzzle behind the lens is the shadow of a name that looms over this entire production, one that animation enthusiasts will recognize immediately: John Lasseter. When Skydance Animation was assembling its leadership, they hired John Lasseter as the head of animation. Lasseter's career history is, to put it carefully, complicated. He is one of the most significant creative forces in the history of animated film, the man behind Toy Story, the architect of Pixar's golden era, and the driving force of Disney Animation's revival. He is also someone who stepped away from Disney under difficult circumstances in 2018. His involvement with Skydance, and therefore with Swapped, is something you cannot ignore when thinking about the film's creative DNA. The project reunited Lasseter with Nathan Greno, who had previously worked under Lasseter's leadership at Disney when making Tangled. That relationship, according to reports, influenced the direction of the film's story, particularly its emphasis on empathy, belonging, and the idea that understanding someone requires genuinely inhabiting their experience. Those were Pixar and Disney's great themes, and they are unmistakably Swapped's themes too. Whether that's a strength or a limitation is a question the film itself never quite settles. Now, with all of that in the box, let's open the film itself. Swapped is a 2026 American animated fantasy adventure comedy. It runs 1 hour and 42 minutes. It is rated PG. It was directed by Nathan Greno, written by John Whittington, Christian Magalhaes, and Robert Snow, alongside Greno and Adam Karp, who all co-wrote the story. It is produced by Skydance Animation and was released on Netflix on May 1, 2026, with a limited theatrical run including a special early screening at the Sebastiani Theatre in Sonoma in January 2026. The voice cast is genuinely impressive on paper. Michael B. Jordan leads the film as Ollie, a small otter-like woodland creature known as a puku, curious and restless in equal measure. Juno Temple voices Ivy, a javan, which is a hybrid of owl and parrot, proud and guarded and sharp in the way someone is when they've had to fight for everything they have. Tracy Morgan brings Boogle to life, a fish companion whose energy is purely joyfully chaotic. Cedric the Entertainer and Justina Machado voice Ali's parents. Ambika Mod and Lali Adifop round out the supporting cast. The genre is animated family adventure, but calling it only that does it a slight disservice and a slight favor simultaneously. It's too magical to be grounded, too thematically ambitious to be pure entertainment, and just familiar enough in its structure to make you feel comfortable when it isn't fully landing. It wants to be Zootopia, it wants to be Tangled, it wants to be its own thing, and it gets closest to that last ambition in its best moments. So, should you watch Swapped? Here's my spoiler-free verdict. Yes, but with measured expectations. If you want a visually spectacular, warmly voiced, thematically sincere animated film that your family can sit around and enjoy together, this delivers that. It has genuine heart. It has moments of real visual beauty that you genuinely won't see anywhere else in 2026. And the voice performances, particularly Jordan and Temple, are far better than you might expect from an animated Netflix original. But if you come in expecting something that will shake you the way the best Pixar films do, the kind of storytelling that puts a crack in your chest that doesn't close for days, Swapped won't take you there. It reaches for that altitude, it sometimes touches it, and then it pulls back just before it really commits. I gave this film a 5.8 out of 10, and by the time we reach our final layer, I'll tell you exactly why that number lives where it does, right on the edge between something that could have been truly special and something that settled for being very good at being very safe. But first, the first watch feeling, because the way this film opens matters. Let me paint you a picture. You press play, and for the first few seconds, you're not sure what you're looking at. The world of the valley reveals itself slowly, not with a grand establishing shot, not with the narrator explaining the rules. It begins at ground level. You're low in the undergrowth. There is something moving through the roots and the earth, something small, something quick, something fizzing with energy and wonder. And then the valley opens up around it, and you stop breathing for just a second. Because the world of Swapped is genuinely, immediately beautiful. The valley doesn't look like any animated landscape you've seen. It's not the keen geometry of Zootopia's city. It's not the sun-drenched meadows of early Disney. It is dense. It is textured. It has the feeling of something grown rather than drawn, as if the animators reached into some deep half-remembered mythology and pulled out a world that has existed longer than anyone watching it can comprehend. The light falls through the canopy in ways that feel almost photographic. The creatures moving through that light look simultaneously alien and deeply alive. I walked into Swap expecting a competent Netflix family film. What the opening 10 minutes gave me was something more ambitious than that. A film trying to build a mythology from scratch, to hand you a world you've never visited and make you feel immediately that you belong in it. That is genuinely hard to do, and Swap does it with confidence. What hooked me in those first 10 minutes was Ali, Michael B. Jordan's voice performance doesn't feel like a celebrity lending their name to a character, it feels inhabited. Oli is curious in the way only someone genuinely unsatisfied with the life they were given can be curious. Not rebelliously, not angrily, but with this aching, open hunger to understand what's beyond the edge of what he knows. You can hear it. That's a real performance. And then, almost immediately, the film introduces Ivy, and the dynamic snaps into place. Two creatures who cannot stand each other, two creatures whose worlds are pulling apart at the seams. And somewhere out there in the valley, a pair of magical pods waiting to blow the walls of both their lives wide open. The atmosphere Swapped creates in its first act is its greatest achievement. It is lush and strange and alive. It makes you lean forward. It makes you want to explore every corner of every frame. And then the story kicks in, and the pace, and the plotting, and the questions begin. But we're not there yet, because this is the moment we go deeper. Let's open this box all the way. So here we are, inside the valley, inside the world. And now it's time to actually live this film, scene by scene, beat by beat, with the kind of attention it deserves and occasionally more attention than it earned. This is the story walkthrough. And at the film box, we don't skim, we don't summarize, we inhabit. So settle in, because we are about to spend a long time inside Swapped, and by the end of this, you see things in it that most people walked right past. Let's start at the very beginning of the world, because Swapped doesn't actually begin with Ollie and Ivy. It begins with an idea, a creation myth, and that choice to ground a body swap comedy in something as ancient and weighty as a Genesis story is either the most ambitious thing about this film or the most revealing of its contradictions, depending on how generously you want to read it. The valley, as the film explains it, is not just a place. It is a living system, a kind of ecological covenant between the creatures that inhabit it. Everything in the valley is connected, the plants to the animals to the soil to something older and more mysterious that the film only ever gestures toward without fully naming. The world design we talked about in our production section becomes a story point here, because if every creature is literally made from the same organic matter as the land itself, then the health of the land is the health of every creature on it. It is one body, one ecosystem, and like all ecosystems, it is fragile in ways that aren't always visible until something breaks. The film introduces us to this world through the perspective of the pukus, the small otter-like creatures who make their home on a tiny island that sits within the broader valley. Picture something like a warm, dense woodland shore, roots curling down into clear water, burrows carved into earth that smells like rain. This is the puku home. And it is full of community, full of routine, full of the particular comfort that comes from knowing exactly where you belong and what your role is within a world that has stayed the same for generations. Ollie doesn't fit there. Not because he's bad or rebellious or broken, but because he's constitutionally incapable of looking at a horizon without wanting to know what's beyond it. This is a character type that animation loves. And for good reason, the restless young hero who can see further than their community is willing to look. We've seen this archetype in Ariel, in Moana, in Rapunzel. Greno worked on Tangled. He knows this territory intimately. And Swap's first act smartly resists the temptation to make Ollie's curiosity purely heroic. His wandering has consequences. His parents, voiced by Cedric the Entertainer and Justina Machado with a warmth that is immediately grounding, aren't wrong to worry about him. The world beyond the Puku Island is genuinely dangerous, and Ollie's confidence in his own instincts has reportedly gotten him into trouble before. What makes Cedric the Entertainer's performance as Ollie's father particularly effective is the texture underneath the comedy. There's a scene early in the film, before the swap, before the adventure begins, where Ollie's father pulls him aside and speaks to him with a directness that cuts through the likeness of everything around it. He doesn't lecture Ollie, he doesn't forbid him from exploring. He tells him something much more complicated than that, something that amounts to, the world beyond our island does not love you the way I do. And when you go out there, you will learn that the hard way. It is a moment of parental love rendered with real weight. And it is a moment the film returns to, emotionally if not literally, at several key points later in the story. On the other side of the valley, and here the film does something cinematically smart, we are introduced not to Ivy in the same gentle, grounded way we met Ollie, but to the Javan world from a distance. We see the aerial cliffs, the high rock formations, the nests built into impossible heights, and we see the Javans in movement, and they are extraordinary. These are creatures that look like someone crossed an owl's silent wisdom with a parrot's fierce intelligence, and then render the whole thing in white wood and burnished feather, and the result is something that is simultaneously alien and immediately comprehensible as a character type. These are creatures who have chosen the high ground, physically and philosophically. They look down at the valley below, and they are afraid. Here's where the film begins to do something genuinely layered and where the story walkthrough has to slow down and pay attention. The Javans are not well, their food supply is diminishing. The particular nutrient-rich plants that sustain them, the exact ecosystem that has fed their community for as long as their history goes back, is failing. And here is a critical story detail that many casual viewers will process as background and then move on from, but which is actually the entire engine of everything that follows. The Javans are starving not because of anything they did wrong, but because of an environmental shift that is beyond their control. Their world is changing, and they have been told by a predator who benefits from their fear that the Pukus are responsible. This is the moment the film stops being a body swap comedy and starts being something with actual teeth. Because this is how division works. This is how communities turn against each other. not through open malice, but through scarcity, through the terrifying vulnerability of a group that is running out of what they need to survive, and the arrival of a voice that tells them who to blame. Ivy doesn't hate Ollie because Ollie is personally her enemy. Ivy has been told a story about the Pukus that explains her suffering, and she has accepted that story because suffering demands an explanation. This is not a cartoon villain's simple prejudice. This is a film about the mechanics of how hatred is manufactured, and in 2026, that is not a subtle observation to make. It is a necessary one. Ivy herself is a more complicated character than the film sometimes gives her credit for being, and Juno Temple's voice performance carries a great deal of the freight here. Temple plays Ivy with a guarded ferocity that occasionally cracks open to reveal something much softer underneath. A creature who has had to be strong for a very long time, who has learned to lead through projection of certainty even when certainty is the last thing she actually feels. Ivy is not cruel, she is frightened. And frightened creatures, the film understands, can do cruel things without ever becoming cruel themselves. That distinction is important. It is also the distinction that most films in this genre don't bother to make. Now, into the story's central mechanism. The magical pods. There is a location in the valley that both communities have, in their different ways, made into a myth. Deep in the forest, in a place that neither Puku nor Javan would normally dare to go, there exists a cluster of luminous plants, organic, glowing ancient things that pulse with a light that seems almost biological, like bioluminescence taken to its logical extreme. These are the pods, and in the mythology of the valley, they are supposed to be either legend or warning, depending on which side of the valley you grew up on. The Pukus consider them a fairy tale. The Javans consider them cursed. The truth, as the film revealed it, is neither and both. Ollie reaches the pods first. He does what curious creatures always do. He goes closer than he should. He reaches out, and in that moment of contact, the magic triggers. Not intentionally, not dramatically, just contact, a touch, a pulse. And then Ivy arrives, having tracked Ollie to this forbidden location because she has been following the trail of someone she has been taught to distrust. Her instinct is confrontation. Her instinct is to drive him away. And in the chaos of that confrontation, two frightened creatures reaching toward and pulling away from each other in the same heartbeat, the pods respond. And the swap happens. The film handles this moment with more visual wit than you might expect. The swap itself is rendered as a kind of full-body dissolution and reassembly, each creature's form unwinding into light before being rewoven inside the other's body. And the immediate aftermath is played entirely for comedy, which is exactly the right instinct, because what follows is genuinely funny. Ali waking up in a body that is twice his normal height, with wings where he expected arms and a beak where he expected a muzzle. Ivy finding herself ground level for the first time in her life, with short limbs and a belly that is embarrassingly round and absolutely no idea how any of it works. Tracy Morgan's Booger enters the story here, and his arrival is one of the film's great comic pleasures. Booger is a fish. Specifically, a fish who lives in the waterways beneath the valley and has developed, through years of eavesdropping on everyone who walks past, an extraordinarily confident and almost entirely wrong understanding of how the world above the waterline operates. He is not smart in any conventional sense. He is not wise. He is not strategically useful. What he is enthusiastic in a way that is almost chemically infectious, and his complete inability to understand the gravity of any situation means that he functions as both comic relief and, in the film's more interesting moments, a kind of unconscious moral compass. Boogle has no prejudice about whether Ollie or Ivy is in the right body, because Boogle has never cared which body anyone is in. He just wants to help. And there is something quietly radical about a character whose empathy is so instinctive that it doesn't require any narrative justification. The three of them, Ollie in Ivy's body, Ivy in Ollie's body, and Boogle just being Boogle, have to figure out fast what has happened to them and how to reverse it. And here the film settles into what one reviewer accurately described as a fetch quest structure, There are stages to reversing the swap. Each stage requires them to travel to a different part of the valley. Each stage introduces a new challenge that their swap bodies make uniquely difficult. And each stage, if you're watching closely, is not just a physical obstacle but an emotional test, forcing Ollie to understand what it means to be Ivy and forcing Ivy to understand what it means to be Ollie. This is where the body swap genre earns its keep as a storytelling device, and the where swapped is at its most genuinely thoughtful. Because the convention of the body swap, at least since Freaky Friday made it an art form, is that the swap forces empathy. You cannot truly understand someone until you live inside their experience, and swap takes that convention seriously in a way that gives the genre real moral weight. When Ollie in Ivy's body has to navigate a community of Javans who trust Ivy and expect her to behave in certain ways, he doesn't just have to learn to use wings. He has to learn what it costs to carry the expectations of a frightened community on your back. He has to understand what Ivy has sacrificed to be the leader her people need, the things she has suppressed, the fears she has hidden, the version of herself she has had to set aside in order to project the strength others needed from her. And when Ivy in Nolly's body walks through the Boku community, the community she has been told her whole life is the enemy, she encounters something that shatters her. She encounters warmth, ordinary, unglamorous, completely sincere warmth. Ollie's parents, not knowing the creature in front of them is not their son, treat the creature wearing Ollie's form with exactly the tenderness that Ollie takes for granted and that Ivy has never once in her life received. And that specific moment of Ivy being loved by the people she was taught to hate, that is the moment Swapped earns its emotional premise. Now the film's central antagonist enters more fully into the picture, and this is where the story's larger conflict comes into sharp focus. The Fire Wolf. The film's villain is a creature of striking design, something between a predator and a natural disaster, rendered in the deep reds and burning embers of wildfire, with an intelligence behind its eyes that is ancient and calculating. The fire wolf has been present in the valley for a long time, but has been contained, held in check by a balance of power that the swap has now disrupted. And the firewolf's goal is simple and terrible in the way only truly simple goals can be. It wants the valley ruled through fear. It has said this directly. It wants fear as the governing principle of a world that has, until now, managed to sustain itself through something more fragile and more beautiful, coexistence. The fire wolf has been whispering to the Javans. This is revealed gradually, and the revelation changes how you see the first act entirely. The food footage that the Javans are suffering is not a random natural disaster. It has been engineered or at least exacerbated by the firewolf's deliberate disruption of the valley's ecosystems. The suffering has a source, and the source has pointed that suffering like a weapon at the Bukus, knowing that frightened creatures need a target. This is manipulation at its most elegant and most horrifying, and the fact that it is rendered in a PG animated film, in tongues that a child can understand but that an adult can feel in their chest, is one of the things about Swapped that I find most worth talking about. Because what the Firewolf understands, what the film, at its sharpest, is arguing, is that empathy is the only true antidote to the kind of division it is manufacturing. Not confrontation, not negotiation, not even justice in its most formal sense. Empathy, the radical act of genuinely experiencing the world from inside someone else's existence, which is, of course, exactly what the swap forces Ollie and Ivy to do. The magical plot device and the film's deepest theme are the same thing. That is elegant writing. That is a screenwriting team doing their job with real intention. The journey through the valley stages takes Ollie and Ivy through several distinct environments, each of which is a visual achievement in its own right. There is a sequence in the high cloud territories, Yavan terrain, where the visual design reaches its peak ambition. The clouds here are not soft and comforting. They are dense and pressurized, lit from within by something that feels less like weather and more like atmosphere in the emotional sense. You feel the altitude, you feel the isolation, and you understand for the first time why the Javans have become who they are. because the world they live in is beautiful and cold and completely, unforgivingly exposed. There is nowhere to hide in the clouds. There is only the performance of strength or the reality of falling. There is a waterfall sequence that the film stages with considerable kinetic bravery. Three unlikely companions who don't know each other and don't trust each other, trying to navigate a physical challenge that none of them are equipped for in their wrong bodies, with the water crashing around them and Boogle being somehow deeply in his element while simultaneously being of practical help whatsoever. This sequence is pure animated comedy at its most physical, and it works because the characters' frustrations with each other feel earned. Ivy's irritation at Ollie's improvisational instincts, Ollie's bewilderment at Ivy's need for a plan, Boogle's announcement that he has a plan, followed by a plan that is absolutely not a plan. This is the trio working as a comedic unit, and in these moments, Swapped finds its rhythm. There is also a sequence in what the film calls the root tunnels, a subterranean network that runs beneath the valley floor, populated by creatures that are among the most visually inventive in the film. The root snakes we mentioned earlier, skate with bark instead of skin, moving with the fluid uncertainty of something that is simultaneously plant and animal, are genuinely unsettling in a way that the film wears lightly. They are not presented as villains. They are presented as something the valley contains, like every ecosystem contains things that are dangerous, not because they choose to be, but because they are designed to be. Ollie in Ivy's body navigates this tunnel sequence with a courage that surprises even himself. And this is the moment, this specific tunnel scene, where Michael B. Jordan's voice performance moves from charming to genuinely moving. Because Ollie in Ivy's body is afraid, and he does it anyway. Not because he has conquered his fear, but because Ivy is watching through his eyes, and he does not want her to see a Puku flinch. That detail, that incredibly specific, unspoken motivation. That is the film at its best. As the journey progresses, the relationship between Ollie and Ivy shifts in the way all great animated partnerships shift, not in a straight line, but in a spiral. They come closer together, then pull apart. They understand each other, then misunderstand. They trust, and then the trust breaks, and then it has to be rebuilt from something deeper than before. The breaking point comes when Ivy discovers in Ollie's body in the Puku community the extent to which her people's suffering has been manufactured. When she understands that the story she was told about the Pukus being responsible for Javan hunger was a story, not a fact, that the enemy she was given was a gift from a predator who needed her fear more than she needed the enemy, the film goes quiet in a way that is rare for animation at this pace. The comedy stops. Ivy stops, and in that stillness you can hear the sound of a whole life's worth of certainty crumbling. Juno Temple plays this moment without a single over-emphatic note. There is no wail, there is no operatic breakdown, there is just a silence, a long, breathing, terrible silence, and then a voice that says something along the lines of, "I was wrong," not as an apology, not as a dramatic confession, but as a statement of fact delivered by someone who is genuinely encountering the feeling of being wrong for the first time. It is a small moment. The film moves past it almost too quickly, but it is the emotional core of everything Swapped is attempting, compressed into about 30 seconds of voice acting and stillness. And this is the moment the box opens completely, because from here everything converges. Ollie and Ivy, their partnership finally built on something real rather than circumstance, begin to understand not just how to reverse the swap but why the swap happened, and why perhaps the valley needed them to understand each other before it would let them go back to who they were. The magical system of the pods, as the film reveals it, is not random, it is responsive. The valley itself, the living, breathing, interconnected organism that the whole world is made of, engineered the encounter, not as punishment, not as accident, as necessity. The valley swapped them because the valley was dying, and the only cure was empathy, and the only way to force empathy, and the only way to force empathy was to make each of them live inside the life of the one they feared most. Now I want to pause the story here, right at this point, right before the final confrontation with the firewolf, because this is where we need to talk about what the film does brilliantly, and there is genuine brilliance here. It would be dishonest not to name it clearly. Let's start with the voice cast, because the performances in Swapped are consistently better than the film's critical reception might lead you to believe. Michael B. Jordan brings something to Ollie that is not a celebrity cameo and not a performance for hire. Jordan plays curiosity as a form of vulnerability. Ollie's openness to the world is also his exposure to it, and that dual quality gives the character a fullness that purely comedic performances rarely achieve. The scene I keep returning to, the one that proves what Jordan is doing here, is the tunnel sequence we described earlier. The specific beat where Ollie in Ivy's body pushes forward, not despite being afraid, but while being afraid. Jordan's voice in that moment doesn't try to be heroic, it tries to be honest. It is the sound of someone choosing to keep moving because the alternative is letting someone else down. That is a real emotional note, and it lands because Jordan plays it without announcing it. Juno Temple is the film's great performance, full stop. She gives Ivy a psychological architecture that is more sophisticated than the script always acknowledges. Temple plays pride not as arrogance but as a defense mechanism, something Ivy has constructed around herself so deliberately and so expertly that even she has started to believe it is her natural state, rather than something built to protect a softer interior. When that armor starts to come apart, slowly, across the second and third acts, Temple plays each crack with extraordinary precision. You never feel like Ivy is breaking down. You feel like she is finally, carefully choosing to let something true come through. The difference between those two things is the difference between a performance and a character. Tracy Morgan's Boogle deserves its own moment of recognition because what could have been an exhausting comic relief character becomes something more interesting through the specific quality of Morgan's performance. Boogle is loud, yes. Boogle is chaotic, yes. But Morgan plays him with a consistency of joy that starts to read less like comedy and more like philosophy. Boogle is genuinely, uncritically happy for other creatures to exist. He has no architecture of suspicion, he has no map of who belongs where. He just responds to whoever is in front of him with everything he has, and in a film that is fundamentally about the cost of categorizing others into enemy and ally, Boogle's instinctive inclusiveness starts to feel less like a joke and more like the film's quietly radical ideal. Is what the valley could be if the valley hadn't been taught to be afraid. Now, the story construction. What Swapped gets structurally right, and this is worth taking seriously, is its thematic integration. The body swap device and the film's core argument about empathy are not separate things that happen to coexist. They are the same thing. The magic is the metaphor. The journey is the therapy. The obstacles are designed to force exactly the growth that the story requires. There is a mathematical elegance to this that you don't always see in animated features, which frequently have wonderful things and then forget to actually dramatize them, letting the moral arrive in dialogue at the end rather than living in every scene from the beginning. Swap doesn't do that. Every challenge Ollie and Ivy face in their swapped bodies is specifically calibrated to teach them something about each other that they couldn't have learned any other way. That is screen lighting doing its job. The direction and visual design deserve extended praise because Nathan Greno has made something here that is aesthetically distinctive in a way that animation rarely achieves on a first attempt outside a major studio. The Valley is not a borrowed world. It is not a mashup of existing fantasy tropes. It is something genuinely invented, a visual philosophy about the relationship between organic life and visual beauty that produces images unlike anything else in 2026 animation. The teaser. The giant walking forest creatures, elephantesque in their base form but surrounded by living foliage and canopy, are among the most extraordinary visual creations in recent animation history. They don't move the way you expect. They don't sound the way you expect. They exist in the valley the way a mountain exists, not as a character but as a fact of the landscape that changes everything around it. Every scene that features them is a quiet masterclass in scale and awe. The cloud sequence we mentioned earlier is the film's single most visually exceptional passage. The way Greno's team has rendered the atmosphere above the valley, the density of cloud, the specific quality of light at altitude, the way the Javans move through it with practiced ease while Ollie struggles with the physics of wings he doesn't yet understand, is technically stunning. The animators have thought deeply about what flight actually feels like as a physical and emotional experience, and they've embedded that understanding in every frame of this sequence. When Ollie in Ivy's body first catches a thermal and rises, when the weight of the earth releases its grip, and there is suddenly just air and light, an impossible distance in every direction, the film captures the pure, vertiginous shock of it in a way that makes you feel it yourself. That is immersive filmmaking. That is animation doing what only animation can do. Siddhartha Kosla's score is, as I said earlier, one of Swap's most underappreciated achievements. Kosla builds the valley's sonic world from the ground up, using organic tones, woodwind instruments, and rhythmic structures that feel less like a Hollywood film score and more like something you'd find woven into the roots of the valley itself. The Buku leitmotif is warm and low and slightly melancholic, like the sound of something that belongs where it is but knows it could belong somewhere bigger. The Javan motif is higher, more angular, built on intervals that feel precarious, beautiful in the way that beautiful things are when they are one wind shift from disaster. When the swap happens, these two themes don't disappear, they migrate. Ollie starts to carry Ivy's musical signature, and Ivy starts to carry Ollie's. And if you're listening for it, that musical detail tells you everything about where each character's emotional journey is going before the script says a word of it. That is compositional storytelling at a very high level. The scene in the film that I find most completely unforgettable, and this is a personal call, but it's one I'll defend, is not the most visually spectacular scene, and it's not the most plot important one. It is a quiet moment in the Puku community, midway through the second act, where Ivy in Ollie's body sits with Ollie's mother, while Ollie's father is somewhere out of frame. Ollie's mother doesn't know she isn't talking to her son. She talks to the creature in front of her the way a mother talks to a child she has been worried about and is relieved to have home. She talks about small things, the quality of the evening light, the smell of something growing nearby, the way the island sounds different when all her family is on it. And Ivy, who has never in her life been given this kind of attention, this ordinary, unconditional, zero stakes tenderness, doesn't know what to do with it. Juno Temple's silence in this scene is the performance of the film, because Ivy says almost nothing. She just receives, and in receiving something she has never had, she begins slowly and irreversibly to understand what she has been fighting against. Not a people, a feeling she didn't know she was allowed to want. That scene is the whole film. Every theme, every argument, every piece of the moral architecture of swapped lives in that quiet, stolen, unearned moment of belonging. If the rest of the film were as focused and as emotionally precise as that one scene, Swapped might have been a masterwork. But the rest of the film is not always that focused. And this is where honesty requires us to open the other side of the box. Here is where Swapped falls short. And it falls short in ways that are specific, fair to name, and genuinely matter to the overall experience. The most persistent problem with Swapped is its pacing, and more precisely, its compulsive need to resolve every obstacle before it has had time to breathe. The fetch quest structure that one reviewer accurately identified is real, and its effect on the film's rhythm is measurable. The film introduces a problem, the characters engage with it, and then almost before the problem has had time to generate genuine dramatic tension, it is solved. This happens consistently enough that you start to anticipate it. And anticipation of resolution is the enemy of suspense. You never quite feel that Ollie and Ivy are truly in danger, because the film won't let them stay in danger long enough for it to register emotionally. Every obstacle is a speed bump. And the best animated adventures, the ones that stay with you, don't give you speed bumps. They give you walls. They make you believe the characters cannot get through. And then the getting through means something. Compare this to the structural confidence of a film like Zootopia, where the obstacles compound on each other, where solving one problem creates a new problem, and the new problem is harder than the last, and the emotional stakes rise with each complication. Swapped doesn't have that architecture. It has a sequence of individually interesting challenges that don't build on each other with enough narrative pressure to create the sense of a genuinely escalating journey. And the consequence is that the second act, despite its many beautiful individual moments, lacks the narrative momentum the film's theme deserves. The Firewolf, as a villain, is the film's most significant missed opportunity. The concept is extraordinary, a creature that deliberately manufactures division in order to rule the resulting chaos. That is a villain idea with genuine real world resonance, and in the right film built with the right level of detail, it could have been genuinely frightening in the way that the best animated villains are frightening, not because they are monstrous, but because they are comprehensible. The firewolf should make you uncomfortable in the way that recognizing a real pattern makes you uncomfortable. But the film doesn't develop the villain with enough depth to achieve this. The firewolf appears. It declares its intentions in fairly unambiguous terms. It pursues the protagonists. And then it is defeated. There is no scene with the firewolf that achieves the complexity of the scene between Ivy and Ollie's mother. The villain is a statement without a conversation, and the film is thematically sophisticated, deserved a more thematically sophisticated antagonist. The world building, though visually spectacular, has structural gaps that some viewers will find genuinely distracting. The ecosystem logic, the specific mechanics of what the Jabans eat, why they eat only that, and how the magical pods relate to the broader food chain, doesn't hold up under close examination. One thoughtful reviewer pointed out that the film's premise requires you to accept that two entire communities of creatures have only one viable food source between them, and that this singular dependency has gone unquestioned for generations. The magical resolution of the food crisis, when it comes, feels like it arrives from outside the story's own logic rather than being built into it from the beginning. This is the definition of a deus ex machina, a solution that the world contained all along, but that only becomes available when the plot needs it to. And it leaves you asking, if this solution existed, why did generations of creatures suffer without it? The film doesn't answer that question. It moves on before you can ask it too loudly. The supporting characters beyond the central trio are underdeveloped in ways that feel like opportunities missed rather than economical choices. Ollie's parents, voiced beautifully by Cedric the Entertainer and Justina Machado, are given warmth and humanity in the early scenes, but then recede into the background at exactly the moment when their perspectives on what is happening in the valley could have added another layer to the story. There are Javan community members who are introduced with enough distinctiveness that you expect them to matter, and then they don't. The world of Swapped feels populated, but not deeply inhabited, and that is the difference between a world you visit and a world you believe in completely. The film's runtime of 1 and 2 minutes also creates specific structural pressures that I think the story hasn't fully solved. The premise is genuinely complex. A body swap in a fully invented world with a political villain, a creation myth, an ecological crisis, and an empathy narrative. And 102 minutes is not enough time to do all of that justice. You can feel a compression throughout the second act, particularly. Moments that deserve to be scenes are condensed into beats. Beats that could become emotional peaks are rushed through to reach the next plot point. The film would have breathed more honestly at 115 minutes, and some of its most interesting ideas, particularly around the political dimension of the Firewolf's manipulation, could have been developed with real depth if the runtime had allowed for it. These are not small problems. They prevent Soap from being the film it is clearly trying to be. And because the film is clearly trying to be something genuinely ambitious, something that talks to children about empathy and to adults about the mechanics of division and fear, The gap between what it reaches for and what it fully grasps feels larger than it would in a film with smaller ambitions. You forgive a mediocre film for its failures. You feel the failures of a nearly great film more acutely because you can see so clearly what they could have been. Let me give you one final thought on the criticism before we move to the next layer, the ending. Not the specific plot details of the ending, we'll get to those in the full spoiler section, but the emotional register of it. Swap's ending is warm and conclusive and leaves everyone where they need to be, and it is, ultimately, slightly too tidy. The best animated films, the ones that become part of how children understand the world, don't resolve completely. They leave something open. They trust the audience to carry the remaining question forward into their own lives. Swap doesn't fully trust its audience that way. It explains itself. It closes every loop. And in doing so, it denies you the experience of sitting with something unfinished, which is where the deepest films live. A 5.8 out of 10. Here's the honest arithmetic of that number. The world, 9 out of 10. The visual ambition, 8.5. The voice performances, 8. The central theme and its integration, 7.5. The pacing, 5. The villain, 4.5. The ending, 6. The average of all of that, weighted by importance, gives you something close to where I landed. A film that is in genuine conversation with greatness, but that cannot sustain that conversation for its full runtime. A film with scenes that belong in a masterpiece, surrounded by a structure that belongs in something more ordinary. 5.8 is not a dismissal. It is a precise description of a film that is almost two different things at once, and that is most interesting in the spaces where those two things meet. Now, let's step back from the valley for a moment. Let's step back from Ollie and Ivy and Boogle and the Firewolf and all of it, and let's look at the world this film walked into. Because a film is never just the sum of its scenes, a film is also a document of its moment. It arrived somewhere specific, at a specific point in time, carrying the weight of everything that was happening in the culture around it, whether it intended to or not, and understanding that context doesn't just help you situate Swapped historically. It helps you understand why this film, this particular story, with this particular set of themes, arrived when it did, and why its reception landed the way it did, and why the gap between its critical score and its emotional resonance with actual audiences is one of the more interesting stories in animation in 2026. So let's open this layer of the box. Swapped arrived on Netflix on the 1st of May, 2026. And to understand what that means, you need to understand what the first half of 2026 looked like for the world that was going to receive it. We are living right now in a period of extraordinary social fracture. This is not a partisan observation. This is not a political statement in any directional sense. It is simply a fact of the moment we inhabit. That the dominant experience of public life across much of the world in the middle years of this decade is one of division, of communities that share geography but no longer share a story, of fear being used as a governing tool by figures who understand, with cold precision, that a frightened population is a controllable one, of the profound and daily challenge of trying to understand the experience of someone whose life looks nothing like yours, and of the profound and daily failure to meet that challenge that plays out in news cycles and social media feeds and family dinner tables in almost every country on earth. Into that world, that specific, fractured, exhausted, searching world, arrives an animated family film about two creatures who have been taught to fear each other, who are forced to inhabit each other's bodies, and who discover in doing so that the fear was manufactured by a predator who needed their division more than they did. You do not have to stretch very far to feel that landing. And here is what is interesting about the critical reception of Swapped. Interesting in a way that goes beyond the usual discourse about whether a film is good or not. The critics who responded most negatively to Swapped tended to engage with it as a craft object, judging it by its structural logic, its pacing, its fidelity to the internal rules of its own world. And on those terms, many of their criticisms are fair, as we've already explored in detail. Benjamin Lee of The Guardian gave it 2 stars, reportedly comparing it unfavorably to another 2026 animated release and characterizing it as a fairly conventional buddy coasted. Grant Harmon's of Screen Rant was significantly harsher, calling it one of Netflix's worst animated films. These are not meaningless responses. They are the responses of people watching the film, as a constructed object that is supposed to work mechanically, not just emotionally. But here is where the audience split from the critics, and it is a significant split. Because for the audiences who found Swapped on Netflix, particularly families watching it together, and particularly younger viewers encountering it with the freshness that children bring to stories that adults have already categorized, the film's emotional argument was not lost in its structural imperfections. Kids don't notice the fetch quest structure. They don't clock the Deus Ex Machina at the end. They feel Ivy sitting with Ollie's mother. They feel Ollie choosing to be brave for someone else. They feel Booger choosing everyone with equal enthusiasm. And they carry those feelings forward. This is a divide that has existed in animation criticism for as long as animation has been reviewed seriously. The tension between craft standards and emotional function. Pixar films tend to close the gap almost completely. Their craft is so exceptional that it delivers emotional payoff at scale across demographics without apology. Swap does not close the gap. Its craft is sometimes exceptional and sometimes frustratingly uneven. But its emotional function, what it is attempting to do in the hearts of the people watching it, is genuine and considerable. And the critical conversation around Swapped has not always been honest about holding both of those things at the same time. The Rotten Tomatoes score of 67% positive, with an average critical rating of 5.8 out of 10, tells you something accurate about the craft. The Metacritic score of 56 out of 100 tells a similar story. What those numbers don't tell you is the volume of audience comments that describe the film as moving or funny or genuinely meaningful in ways the reviewer did not expect from something they nearly scrolled past. The gap between those two data sets is where the most interesting conversation about Swap lives. Now, what was the animation landscape looking like when Swapped arrived? Because this context matters enormously for understanding why the critical reception was as complicated as it was. 2026 has already been a surprisingly rich year for animation. Hoppers, the film that Benjamin Lee at The Guardian mentioned in his comparison, had arrived earlier in the year and had been received as something of a revelation, a tightly constructed, emotionally precise animated feature that demonstrated what ambitious animation could look like when every element of its craft was functioning at the highest level. The comparison between Hoppers and Swapped in critical circles was inevitable and arguably somewhat unfair because Hoppers and Swapped are attempting very different things in very different ways, and using one to diminish the other tells you more about critical expectations than it does about either film's individual achievement. What is genuinely true is that Swapped arrived into a moment where the bar for animated family films was being actively and publicly raised, where the conversation about what the genre could and should achieve was louder than it had been in a decade. And arriving into that elevated conversation with a film that is visually extraordinary and thematically sincere but structurally uneven is not an easy position to be in. Swapped was not reviewed as the film it is. In many cases, it was reviewed as the film it was supposed to be next to something that was doing everything right. That is not always a fair measuring stick. The production history also shaped the critical reception in ways that were not always stated directly but were certainly present. The Skydance Animation brand carries the complicated shadow of John Lasseter's involvement, a creative figure whose work is indisputably brilliant and whose personal history is genuinely difficult. Some critics noted this context without engaging with it deeply. Others sidestepped it entirely, but it hung in the air above Swap's release in a way that it would be dishonest to pretend didn't exist. Whether that context affected how the film was evaluated, whether critics came in predisposed toward a certain reading, is impossible to quantify. What is possible to observe is that the film's reception was more polarized than its content alone would easily explain. The streaming release model also shaped how Swap was received in ways that are worth examining carefully. When a film premieres on Netflix without a significant theatrical campaign, it enters a different kind of critical conversation than a wide theatrical release. It doesn't benefit from the shared cultural event of opening weekend. It doesn't have the box office narrative that gives a film momentum and visibility in the first weeks of its life. It simply appears. And in the attention economy of streaming, appearing is often the hardest part because the competition for attention on a platform that contains everything is total and continuous. A film on Netflix has to be discovered in a way that a theatrical release does not. And Swapped, with its relatively quiet marketing push and its midweek 1st of May premiere date, did not arrive with the kind of cultural noise that creates a genuine shared moment. But here is what happens with certain films that arrive quietly on streaming. They get found, not on opening weekend, not in the first wave of reviews, but in the weeks and months after release when word of mouth travels through the specific communities that a film speaks to most directly. Parent communities, animation enthusiast communities, communities gathered around the particular need for stories about empathy and connection in a moment when those stories feel necessary rather than optional. Swap's streaming life is still early. It has been on Netflix only since May 26 and we are still in the first chapter of its discovery. But the signs are there, the comments are there. The conversations are beginning to suggest that this film is finding its audience in the way that genuinely resonant films sometimes do. Slowly, quietly, person by person, recommendation by recommendation. The Swapped fairy timeless or perfectly of its era? This is a question I want to take seriously because it's a question that says something real about the film's durability. On One Never Swapped is unmistakably a film of 2026. Its themes, manufactured division, the weaponization of fear, the radical necessity of perspective taking, are not abstract philosophical concerns. They are the defining anxieties of the cultural moment the film was made in. In 20 years, when the specific texture of 2026 is social fractures has shifted into history, some of the film's urgency will inevitably read differently. The political allegory that feels so immediate now will feel more like a period concern. The way that films made in certain historical moments carry the specific anxiety of those moments in ways that later audiences recognize but don't personally feel. But on another level, on the level of what Swapped is actually about at its most essential, the film is dealing with something that does not age. They need to understand someone from inside their experience rather than from outside it. The way that fear of the other is always a taught response rather than an instinctive one. The discovery that the enemy you were given was given to you by something that needed you to have an enemy. These are not 2036 concerns. These are human concerns. They're as old as every story ever told about two people who were supposed to hate each other and found something else instead. And that dimension of Swokt, that ancient, recurrent, permanently necessary dimension, is what will keep it being watched long after the specific cultural moment that produced it has become a chapter in a history book. So is it timeless? Not completely. But it is built on timeless material. And the difference between those two things is exactly the difference between a 5.8 and an 8. Now, there are no awards to discuss yet for Swapped. It is too recent, too close to the present moment we're sitting in for any major ceremony to have assessed it. But there are conversations worth having about what the film deserves recognition for, if that recognition comes. The visual design, the world of the valley, the zoo, the cloud sequences, the root tunnels, absolutely deserves to be in conversation for best animated feature at the level of visual ambition. Siddhartha Kosla's score deserves to be heard by more ears than have found it so far. And Juno Temple's voice performance, genuinely one of the more complete voice acting achievements in recent family animation, deserves the kind of specific acknowledgement that animated performances rarely receive, partly because the industry still doesn't fully know how to honor the specific craft of acting in a recording booth for a character that will be drawn rather than photographed. What may be unfairly overlooked if the awards conversation does come is the film's thematic courage. It is easy to underestimate how hard it is to make an animated film for children that deals honestly with the mechanics of prejudice, that shows not just that prejudice is wrong, but how it works, where it comes from, who benefits from it, and what it actually costs to overcome it. Most films in this space opt for a simpler version of the message: different is okay. Swapped goes further. It argues that different is necessary, that the survival of the valley literally depends on the different communities within it learning to share a story. That is not a simple message. That is a complex and demanding moral argument dressed in bark and feather and animated light. And whoever was responsible for insisting that the film go there, that it not settle for the simpler version, deserves to have that instinct honored. Now let's go deeper, because behind the plot mechanics, behind the wall design, behind the voice performances and the pacing problems and all of it, there is a question that every film worth talking about eventually asks you to sit with. And Swap asked it quietly, in the way that good films ask their central questions, not through dialogue, not through a character explaining the theme, but through the accumulated weight of everything that happens. What is Swapped really about? On the surface, the outermost layer of the box, it's about two animals who swap bodies and go on an adventure. That is true. That is what happens. But that's not what it's about. One layer deeper, and this is the layer most reviews engage with, it's about empathy, about the radical transformative power of genuinely inhabiting someone else's experience. The swap is the metaphor. You cannot understand a life from outside it. You have to enter. You have to give up the comfort of your own body, your own assumptions, your own certainty about what the world looks like and how it works, and allow yourself to be disoriented inside someone else's truth. This is true. This is what the film is arguing, and it argues it with sincerity. But go one layer deeper than that into the place where the film's most uncomfortable insight lives, and Swapped is about something else entirely. Something that the film gestures forward with more honesty than most animated films are willing to attempt. Swapped is about the specific human capacity to need an enemy, not the capacity to have enemies, the capacity to need them. The firewolf's power doesn't come from superior strength or superior intelligence. It comes from a deep and accurate understanding of something about the creatures in the valley, something that is not unique to pukus or javans, something that is not specific to animated woodland creatures in a fictional ecosystem. It comes from understanding that communities under pressure will always reach for an explanation of their suffering, and that an explanation which involves an identifiable enemy is always more emotionally satisfying than an explanation which involves complexity or randomness or the slow grinding pressure of environmental change that has no single face to blame. The Javans are hungry. Hunger is terrifying. Hunger with no explanation is unbearable. Hunger with an explanation, even a forced one, even one that requires you to accept something that doesn't quite hold up under scrutiny, is survivable. Because explanation gives you agency. It tells you where to direct your fear. It transforms helplessness into something that at least has the shape of a response. And the firewolf understands this. It manufactures a story, one that points Javan's suffering at Puku existence, not because it hates the Javans, and not even necessarily because it hates the Pukus. It manufactures the story because it needs a division. Division is its food. Fear is its sustenance. And communities that have been given a clear enemy are communities that are too busy fighting each other to notice the predator circling them both. That's what most people miss when they watch Swap. The firewolf never lies about its intentions. Not once. It says, directly, in terms that any viewer can process, I want this valley ruled by fear. It doesn't disguise this. It doesn't offer a false alternative. It states its goal openly. Because in the world the film is depicting, the goal doesn't need to be hidden. The goal is self-sustaining. Once the division is established deeply enough, the communities will maintain it themselves. They will manufacture new reasons to fear each other even after the original manufactured reason has been exposed. Because fear, once it has been lived with long enough, stops feeling like a response to a specific threat and starts feeling like a natural condition. starts feeling like the truth of how the world works rather than a story someone told you about it. This is the film's deepest layer, and it is an extraordinarily dark idea to put inside a PG animated movie for families. But here is why it works, why this darkness doesn't overwhelm the film or betray its audience. Because the film's answer to that dark idea is not naive. It is not, we simply need to be nicer to each other. It is not, if we choose kindness, hatred will dissolve. The film's answer is structural, it is physical, it is radical in the most literal sense of the word. It goes to the root. The answer Swapped offers is that you cannot dismantle a manufactured division through argument. You cannot reason someone out of a fear that was not reasoned into them. The only antidote is experience. Direct, unmediated, body level experience of the life they were told to fear. The swap is not a metaphor for conversation. It is a metaphor for something more demanding than conversation, the genuine, full, disorienting commitment to living inside a truth that is not your own. And here is where the film connects to something you have probably felt in your own life. Think about a time when you changed your mind about something that mattered, not because someone argued you into it, but because something happened to you, an experience that you could not have prepared for, that put you into contact with a reality you had only previously understood from the outside. Think about a time when a person you expected to be one thing turned out to be something entirely different, not because they performed differently for you, but because you ended up somewhere unexpected with your guard down and your assumptions off, and you simply encountered a human being rather than a category. That is what Ivy feels when Ollie's mother speaks to her. Not an argument, not a lesson, an encounter. A moment of being treated as a person before she has had a chance to perform as a symbol. And that moment, as I said earlier, is the whole film. Now think about the reverse of that experience. Think about a time when you realized that something you believed, something you had organized your understanding of the world around, was the result of a story that served someone else's interests more than your own. The specific, quiet devastation of that realization. The grief that comes not just from discovering you were wrong, but from understanding that being wrong cost something, that the wrong belief had consequences for you and for the people it was pointed at. Ivy's moment of reckoning in the Poku community carries that specific weight, and it does not try to make that reckoning comfortable or quick. It sits in it for the brief, valuable time the film allows before it has to move forward. These are not small things. These are the emotional experiences that define how we understand ourselves and each other in the world beyond the screen. Swapped is not a children's film that accidentally contains adult insight. It is a film for families that has been built around adult insight from the beginning, and that trusts children to carry more of that weight than most animated films give them credit for being able to carry. This connects to something I think about often when watching films made for younger audiences. There is a tendency in popular criticism to evaluate children's films primarily by the standard of whether they entertain, whether they're fun enough, whether they move fast enough, whether the adults in the room can sit through them without glancing at their phones. These are legitimate concerns, but they are not the most important concerns. The most important concern, the one that separates the films that become part of how a generation understands the world from the films that are simply enjoyable for 90 minutes, is whether the film gives its young audience an emotional experience they can take forward, a model for a feeling they haven't yet had words for, a story that, when they encounter something similar in their actual lives, gives them a framework for what they're feeling and a direction for how to move through it. Swapped at its best does that. When a child who watches this film grows up and encounters a community that has been given a manufactured enemy, when they see the mechanics of division being deployed in the real world, they will have a story for it. They will have a vocabulary for the feeling of recognizing that the fear was pointed there on purpose. They will have seen, in the safe container of an animated adventure, what it looks like when someone inhabits the experience of the person they were supposed to fear, and what happens to the fear when that happens. That is not nothing. That is actually quite a lot. And it is the reason that 5.8, for all its honest accounting of craft failures, does not tell the complete story of what Swapped is worth. Now I want to go one layer deeper still into the most personal and specific dimension of what this film is doing beneath its surface. And then we're going to go into full spoiler territory. We're going to open every remaining door in this box. But before we do, one more thing. One more layer. There is a quality in Swap that I find genuinely moving and that I think gets lost in discussions of the film's structural problems. It is the quality of longing. Every major character in Swapped is longing for something they don't have. Ollie longs for a world beyond the edges of the island he was born on. He longs for the experience of a life larger than the one that was designed for him by his community and his biology. He longs in the most basic and recognizable way for more without quite knowing what more means or whether it's something he's allowed to want. Ivy longs for safety. This is less obvious than Ollie's longing because Ivy projects strength so consistently and so convincingly that even the film sometimes seems to forget it. But underneath the ferocity, underneath the leadership, underneath the cold competence she performs at every moment, Ivy wants to stop being responsible for everything. She wants to put down the weight of being the one who keeps her community together. She longs for the particular safety of being loved without having earned it, loved simply because she exists rather than because of what she can do or protect or provide. This is what Ollie's mother gives her. This is why that scene is the pivot point of the entire film. Bogle longs for, and this is the most heartbreaking longing in the film precisely because it's presented as comedy, companionship. Bogle has clearly been alone for a very long time. His enthusiasm for the quest, for the trio, for the sheer fact of having somewhere to go with someone to go there with, is so total and so unguarded that it crosses a line from funny into something more tender. He is a creature who loves being part of something and who has not been part of something for long enough that the fact of being included is by itself a complete joy. There is a specific quality of gratitude in Tracy Morgan's performance that is most visible in the quieter moments between the big comedy beats, moments where Bogle is simply watching Ollie and Ivy exist in the same space without trying to kill each other, and the look on his face is something close to awe, as if he has never seen anything so beautiful as two creatures choosing not to be enemies, and the valley itself longs for wholeness. This is the film's most abstract and most quietly devastating dimension. The valley is sick, not just politically, not just ecologically. It is sick in the way a body is sick when its different parts have stopped communicating with each other, when the immune system has started attacking the host. The Pukus and the Jabans are not just two communities in conflict. They are, in the film's deepest reading, two halves of a single organism that has forgotten it is one thing. The valley cannot survive their separation. It needs them together not as a political arrangement but as a biological necessity. And the swap? The valley's own desperate, ancient, magical intervention is the act of a living system trying to heal itself by forcing its separated parts to feel each other from the inside. That is a beautiful idea. That is an idea about the world that is true beyond the film's fictional borders. And it is the idea that makes me most grateful that Swapped exists, even with all its imperfections held clearly in view. Now, full spoilers from this point. Alright, full spoilers from this point. If you haven't seen the film yet, close this now, go watch it, and come back when you're ready. Trust me, you'll want to experience it fresh. Okay, you're still here. Let's go all the way in. The ending of Soaped hinges on a revelation that the film has been slowly building since its first act, though many viewers won't register it as a building until the final sequence makes it explicit. Here is what the film has been quietly arguing in its background detail from the very beginning. The magical pods that cause the swap are not random or accidental. They are not a natural phenomenon that happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. They are the valley's own immune response. They are the mechanism by which the valley, when its internal ecology reaches a point of crisis, intervenes directly in the lives of the creatures that make it up. This is revealed in the climax through the zoo, those extraordinary walking forest creatures we have been seeing in the background of various scenes throughout the film. These are not simply part of the landscape, they are the landscape made animate. They are the valley's own consciousness expressing itself in physical form. And in the final act, when the firewolf's assault on the valley reaches its peak, when the division between Puku and Javan has been pushed to the brink of open conflict, and the firewolf's manufactured crisis is on the verge of achieving everything it has been working toward, the zoo respond. This is a sequence that some critics characterized as a deus ex machina, and I want to spend real time on this characterization because I think it's simultaneously accurate and slightly unfair. It is accurate in the sense that the Dezo's intervention does arrive from outside the central quest's logic. Ollie and Ivy have been working toward reversing the swap through their own agency, and the Dezo's involvement in the final resolution represents a force beyond their control shaping the outcome. In the classic definition, this is indeed a deus ex machina, a solution that arrives from a source that was not established as the central means of resolution. But here is why I think the characterization, while technically accurate, misses something important about what the film is doing. The Dizo have been in every major scene of the film. They have been visible quietly in the background of the Pukuku community. They have been present at the edge of the cloud sequences. They have been standing at the entrance to the root tunnels. If you watch Swapped a second time, and I'm about to give you the reason why a second watch is rewarding in ways the first isn't, you will notice that the zoo are always present at the moment when the film's emotional stakes reach their highest point. They are not background decoration, they are witnesses. They are the valley watching its own story unfold. And their intervention in the climax is not the arrival of something new, it is the culmination of something that has been present in every frame, watching and waiting for the moment when the creatures within the valley demonstrated enough willingness to choose empathy over fear that the valley itself could complete the healing they began. In other words, the Zao don't resolve the crisis for Ollie and Ivy. Ollie and Ivy resolve the crisis for the valley. These are the valley's response to that resolution. The healing that becomes possible once the internal division has been addressed at its root. Read this way, the ending is not a deus ex machina at all. It is the payoff of a thematic argument that has been running since the first scene. The film just didn't communicate the setup clearly enough for most first-time viewers to clock it as setup rather than decoration. This is one of Swap's most interesting hidden details. These are the film's most sophisticated piece of visual storytelling, operating entirely in the background, without a line of dialogue, without a moment of direct narrative attention. Just there, in every critical scene, registering the emotional temperature of what the creatures around them are doing. If the film had a stronger critical reception, this detail would be celebrated as a masterwork of visual subtext. Because it lands in the middle of mixed reviews, it has mostly gone unnoticed. Now let's talk about the twist. Because Swapped has a twist that the trailers obscured entirely, and that changes the emotional meaning of the film's first act once you know it. The firewolf is not an outsider to the valley. This is revealed approximately two-thirds of the way through the film, and it reconfigures everything you thought you understood about the conflict. The firewolf was once part of the valley's ecosystem. Specifically, it was once the valley's apex predator, in a balanced sense, part of the food chain that kept the whole system in equilibrium. But something happened, and the film is deliberately opaque about exactly when and exactly how that broke the firewolf away from that balance. The creature that now threatens the valley from outside was once a creature that held a valley together from within. It is not attacking something foreign to it. It is attacking something it used to belong to. And here is a detail that the film buries deep enough that most viewers will miss it on a first watch. The firewolf's manipulation of the Javan food supply is not just a tactical move to create division. It is a mirror of what happened to the firewolf itself. The firewolf's loss of its place in the valley's ecosystem. Whatever caused it, The film keeps the exact origin story tantalizingly just out of frame was the original wound. The manipulation of the Javan's food supply is the fire wolf recreating, intentionally, the condition that destroyed it. It is spreading its own wound, making other creatures feel what it felt, because the only power left to something that has been expelled from a living system is to expel others from it too. This is an extraordinarily dark piece of character construction. It means the villain of Swapped is not a creature that was born evil, it is a creature that was broken, and that has been broken long enough that it has lost the ability to imagine healing, and so it pursues destruction instead. The firewolf cannot go back, it knows it cannot go back, and its response to the impossibility of its own return is to ensure that others cannot return either. To make the valley a place where belonging is impossible for everyone because belonging has become impossible for itself. The film doesn't lean into this backstory as heavily as it should. This is one of the criticisms I made earlier, that the villain is underdeveloped and the full weight of this backstory would have enormously deepened the firewolf's impact as an antagonist. But the detail is there. It is embedded in the visual design of the firewolf scenes, the specific way it interacts with valley spaces, the moments where it almost seems to pause briefly before the destruction continues, as if some muscle memory of belonging is still present somewhere beneath the predation. These moments are fleeting, they are not narratively resolved, but they are there for those watching closely enough to find them. Now let's go to the specific plot of the climax, because the sequence of events in the final act is more layered than a first watch reveals. After the revelation that the firewolf is a valley native, and after the emotional fallout of Ivy's discovery that her people's suffering was engineered, the central conflict reaches its critical point. The Javan community, manipulated to the breaking point, is preparing to take direct action against the Pukus. An attack is coming. The division has been pushed far enough that the manufactured enemy has become, in the minds of the community, a real and immediate threat requiring a real and immediate response. This is the Firewolf's endgame. Once the communities destroy each other, the valley's balanced ecosystem collapses, and the resulting chaos, the absence of the cooperative coexistence that has, despite everything, been holding the valley's basic systems together, creates the conditions for something far older and more destructive to fill the vacuum. Exactly what that something is, the film leaves productively ambiguous. But the implication is clear. A valley without cooperation is a valley that can only sustain one thing: fear. And the fire wolf is fear's architect. Ollie and Ivy, still in each other's bodies, their quest to reverse the swap incomplete, make a decision that is the moral center of the entire film. They choose to enter the conflict not to fight, but to be seen. Specifically, Ivy in Ollie's body chooses to stand in front of her own people, the Javans, and speak, not as Ollie, as herself, revealing that she, Ivy, the leader, the creature they trust most, has been living inside a Puku's body and has discovered from inside that body, in that community with those people, that everything she was told about them was wrong. This is the emotional climax of the film, and it is genuinely powerful because Ivy is not asking her community to trust the Bukos. She is not asking them to abandon their fear through an act of will. She is testifying. She is saying, I was you. I believed what you believe. I felt what you feel. And then I went inside the life of the enemy, literally inside it, in a way that was physically and existentially total. And I found not an enemy but a mirror. A community with the same fears, the same loves, the same specific grief of trying to survive in a world that keeps getting harder, trying to hold their families together in a valley that is slowly coming apart. Not a threat, a reflection. The Javan community's response to this testimony is not an immediate reversal. This is one of the film's most mature storytelling decisions, and one that doesn't get the credit it deserves. The Javans don't simply choose to believe Ivy and stand down. There is resistance. There is this specific, uncomfortable friction of a community being asked to relinquish a story that has organized their suffering and given it direction. Some of the Javans cannot do it. Not immediately, not in the heat of the moment. And Ivy doesn't ask them to, she asks only that they wait. That they wait and watch and hold their fear still for long enough to see what happens when the firewolf no longer has the division to feed on. This is a more honest portrayal of how community change actually works than most films, animated or otherwise, are willing to depict. Change at the community level is not a switch. It is not a moment of collective clarity where everyone simultaneously chooses the better path. It is slower than that. It is more painful than that. It is a process of some people moving first and others following when they see that the ones who moved first did not fall. Swapped understands this, and it dramatizes it, briefly but honestly, in the way the Javan community fractures and then slowly, unevenly, begins to reconsolidate around a different story. Meanwhile, and the film cross-cuts between these two threads with increasing urgency, Ollie in Ivy's body is dealing with the firewolf directly, and this confrontation is the film's most visually spectacular sequence, as well as its most revealing in terms of character. Ollie in Ivy's body faces the firewolf not as a warrior. The film is careful not to position its protagonist as someone who defeats the villain to superior force, but as a questioner. The thing that Ollie does in this confrontation is ask the firewolf a question that the creature has not been asked before. Not, why are you doing this? But, where do you come from? What happened to you? What did you lose? The firewolf does not answer, or rather, it does not answer in words. But its response to being asked this question is the most revealing thing in the film. It stops. For a genuine, extended, meaningful beat, a pause that the film commits to with real bravery, holding the silence longer than commercial instinct would typically allow, the firewolf stops. And in that stopping, something flickers in its expression that is not aggression and not calculation, something older, something that looks briefly and ambiguously like belief. The film does not resolve this moment. It does not turn the firewolf into a sympathetic figure. It does not give the villain a redemption arc. What it does, and this is a choice I find genuinely courageous for a family film, is acknowledge the wound. Ollie's question cracks something open in the firewolf's surface, and what comes through the crack is not humanity exactly, but something like its echo, the remnant of a creature that once belonged somewhere, the ghost of an ecosystem connection that was severed long ago. And then the zoo arrive. The valley's intervention, as I described it earlier, is the culmination of everything that Ollie and Ivy have built toward. The swap reverses, not because the quest was completed, not because the specific magical sequence was fulfilled, but because the valley recognizes that what needed to happen between these two creatures has happened. The empathy has been achieved, the testimony has been given, the community has begun, however fractionally, to shift. The internal division that was the valley's wound has been addressed at its source. And so the valley, through its own ancient conscious living mechanism, completes the healing. Ollie and Ivy return to their own bodies simultaneously, and the film is careful about how this is staged. This is a detail that rewards close attention. They return not facing the same direction, not side by side in the traditional partnership confirmed staging that animated finales usually employ. They return facing each other, standing in each other's space, in the place where they first met, where the swap happened, where the pods first pulsed with light, and they are each in their own bodies standing slightly differently than they were before. Ollie is standing a little taller, Ivy is standing a little softer. Each of them has carried something back from the body they inhabited. Each of them has returned to themselves changed by the experience of the other, not transformed entirely, not stripped of who they are, but expanded, made larger by the encounter with a different way of being in the world. This staging choice is the film saying its thesis one final time in purely visual language without a word of dialogue. You cannot inhabit another life without being changed by it. You cannot return to who you were before. The swap always leaves a residue. And the residue, the permanent alteration of perspective that comes from genuine empathetic experience, is the only lasting protection against the story being manufactured again. The firewolf is not destroyed in the traditional animated villain sense. This is another choice worth examining. It is expelled from the valley, pushed back by the force of the valley's own restored internal health to whatever territory exists beyond the ecosystem's borders. The valley's immune system, healed by the reconnection of its separate communities, produces a biological response that the firewolf's destructive energy cannot sustain itself within. It is not defeated by Ollie or Ivy. It is made irrelevant by the health of the thing it was feeding on. Division cannot sustain a predator in a valley that has chosen cooperation. The firewolf doesn't die, it simply has nothing left to eat. There is something deeply satisfying about this as a narrative choice, and also something that might frustrate certain audiences who want a more cathartic physical confrontation. The firewolf is not punished. It is not redeemed. It is, and this is the word the film's logic uses, outgrown. The valley outgrows the conditions that made the firewolf's manipulation possible, and the firewolf without those conditions to feed on cannot survive in this particular ecosystem anymore. This is ecology as moral philosophy. This is the film using its own words rules to make an argument about how you actually defeat the kind of fear the firewolf represents, not by fighting it, by healing the wound it was feeding on. There are several foreshadowing details in the film's first act that land very differently once you know how the story ends. The first time we see the zoo, and this is easy to miss because the film doesn't call attention to it, they are positioned at the exact location where the pods are growing. They have been there the whole time. Standing at the entrance to the place where the swap will happen, in the film's first sequence where the valley is introduced. The zoo are not discovering the pods in the climax. They have always been there. They have been waiting for the moment when the creatures who needed to find the pods would find them. The second foreshadowing detail concerns Boogle. Early in the film, when Boogle is introduced, there is a brief visual beat, easy to laugh past and move on from, where Boogle is shown trying to get the attention of both the Puku in a Javan who are passing near his waterway simultaneously. He tries to speak to both of them at once. Both ignore him. He watches them go in opposite directions, and his expression for just a fraction of a second before the comedy reasserts itself is one of genuine sadness. He has been watching this division for a long time. He has been trying to bridge it for a long time. In his own chaotic, ineffective, completely unsophisticated way, by simply wanting to be friends with everyone, by refusing to accept the categories. Bogle has been attempting to do what the swap eventually forces Ollie and Ivy to do deliberately. He has just been doing it without any mechanism for making it work. Until now, until these two specific creatures fall into the water beside him and need him to show them a world they couldn't find alone. Bogle, led this way, is not comic relief at all. He is the valley's most persistent attempt at its own healing, the lowest tech, least sophisticated, most purely instinctive version of the empathy the pods eventually engineer by force. He is what happens when the impulse toward connection exists without any mechanism to overcome the structures that prevent it. And the fact that the film presents this as comedy, as the lovable futility of a fish trying to make friends across a divide that has been built to last, is either brilliantly ironic or accidentally profound, and I genuinely cannot decide which. There is no post-credits scene in Swapped. The film ends on the valley, on a wide, lingering, patient shot of the ecosystem in its restored health, with Pukus and Javans and Bugu all present in the same frame. Not touching, not perfectly integrated, but sharing space. This is important. They are sharing space. They are not yet a single community. They are not yet one thing. The division has been addressed at its source, but it has not magically disappeared. The history of the fear is still there. The work of building something real across that history is still ahead. The film ends before that work is done, not because it doesn't believe in the work, but because it knows that the work cannot be shown in the space of a single story. It can only be begun, and beginning, genuine, irreversible beginning, is enough. My personal reaction to the ending is complicated in ways that align with everything I've said about the film throughout this breakdown. I found it emotionally affecting and structurally hasty in almost equal measure. The final sequence moves faster than it needs to. The Dizo's arrival, the Firewolf's expulsion, the swap reversal, and the valley's restoration happen in a compressed window of screen time that doesn't give any of these events the weight they have earned. The emotional payoff is real, but it arrives in a rush that slightly undercuts it. I wanted the film to pause at the moment Ollie and Ivy are back in their own bodies and looking at each other, and simply breathe, simply be in that moment for long enough that I could be in it too. It doesn't quite give me that time. It moves on toward the warmth, toward the light, toward the beautiful white shot of the valley healing itself. And the beauty is genuine. But I wanted one more breath inside the specific, extraordinary, unrepeatable experience of two creatures who have lived inside each other's skin, standing at the place where it began, looking at each other with eyes that now see so much more than they did before. That's what I wanted. The film gives me something close to it. Close, but not quite at the altitude I was reaching for. 5.8, and every fraction of it accounted for. And so, here we are, at the final layer of the box, the one that holds the verdict, the one where everything we have opened, examined, turned over in the light, held up against his own ambitions, and laid honestly on the table, all of it converges into a single question. Was swapped worth your time? And not just your time in the abstract, but your specific time, your particular sensibility, your specific relationship with animated film, your specific hunger for stories that do something to you rather than simply happen in your presence. Let me give you the number first, and then I want to spend real time explaining it, because the number without explanation is just noise, and everything we do at the film box is about going deeper than the noise. 5.8 out of 10. That is my honest, considered, fully argued reading for Swap. And I want to be precise about what that number means in the way I use it, because 5.8 is not a dismissal and it is not a concession. It is a specific diagnosis. It is the number that lives exactly at the intersection of genuine ambition and uneven execution, the precise coordinate on the map of film quality where a movie that is reaching for something real keeps failing to close the final distance between what it wants to be and what it manages to become. 5.8 is not a bad film. 5.8 is a film that has the materials of a great one and cannot always find the architecture to hold them together. Here's the thing about Swapped that I keep returning to, even now, even having spent all of this time taking it apart and laying its pieces out in the open. The scenes that work in this film work at a level that many films with far higher scores never approach. The moment where Ivy sits with Ollie's mother and receives unconditional love from the family of her supposed enemy, that scene is a 9.5 out of 10. The tunnel sequence where Ollie in Ivy's body chooses bravery not for himself, but for the creature watching through his eyes, that is an 8.5. The visual philosophy of the valley's creature design, bark and root and canopy made animal, every character a literal piece of the land, that is a 9. Siddhartha Khosla's score, with its mirroring leitmotifs, and its quietly radical compositional decision to let Ollie and Ivy carry each other's musical DNA after the swap, that is an 8.5, easy. But the second act spacing issues are a 4. The Firewolf's underdeveloped backstory is a 4.5. The Deus Ex Machina question around the Dizo, which I argued has more thematic justification than most critics granted it, but which is still imperfectly set up, sits at a 5.5 even with the most charitable reading. The ending's refusal to pause and breathe at the exact moment it has most earned the right to pause and breathe. That is a 6, because the impulse is right even if the execution falls short. Average all of that, weighted by the importance of each element to the overall experience, and you land somewhere close to 5.8. A film of extraordinary parts that does not consistently achieve the sum of those parts. Now, who should watch Swapped? If you are a parent looking for something to watch with your children, something that will not ball you into your phone, that will give your kids a genuine emotional experience rather than 90 minutes of distraction, watch Swapped. Watch it soon and watch it together. because this is a film that generates conversation, and the best thing that can happen after a family watches a film together is that they talk about it. Swapped gives families something worth talking about. The questions it raises about why we fear people we don't know, about how someone makes you afraid of a group of people and why they might want to, about what it would actually feel like to wake up inside a completely different life. These are not questions that exhaust themselves in the film's runtime. They extend outward into the real world in ways that children will feel and that a parent can help them articulate. If you are an animation enthusiast, someone who tracks the genre seriously, who cares about the craft of it, who measures animated films against the standard of the form's greatest achievements, watch Swapped with tempered expectations and genuine curiosity. Do not watch it looking for Pixar. Do not watch it against the yardstick of Zootopia or Tangled or Inside Out. Watch it on its own terms, as a first full-length feature from a studio that is still finding its voice, made by a director returning to the format after 16 years and clearly trying to say something that matters. You will find real achievement in it. You will also find real frustration. Both of those things are worth your attention. If you are someone who has been burned by Netflix animated originals before, someone who went in on a streaming family film and came out feeling like you'd been handed something that looked expensive but felt hollow, I understand your hesitation, and I want to tell you honestly that Swapped is not that film. It is not hollow. It has genuine warmth at its center and genuine ambition in its design. The craft problems are real, but they are the problems of a film trying too hard, rather than a film not trying at all. And that distinction matters more than the star rating. If you are someone who watches animated films alone as an adult because you believe correctly that the best animated films speak to adult concerns through the particular emotional directness that the format allows, Swap has things for you. The Firewolf's manipulation of community fear, the specific texture of Ivy's grief when her organizing story collapses, the quiet radicalism of Bugle's unconditional inclusion, the image of two bodies returning to themselves changed by the experience of the other. These are adult ideas in a film that is ostensibly for children. You will find them. They are worth finding. Who might not connect with Swapped? If you are someone who needs structural tightness in order to feel fully invested in a story, someone for whom pacing issues are not an inconvenience but a fundamental barrier to engagement, you may struggle. The second act's fetch quest rhythm is persistent enough that if it catches you wrong, it will keep catching you wrong, and no amount of visual beauty will fully compensate for the sensation of watching a film that keeps stopping its own momentum to introduce and then immediately resolve a new obstacle. If you are looking for a villain that gives you the kind of satisfying, multi-dimensional menace that the great animated antagonists deliver, the Hans of Frozen, the Syndrome of the Incredibles, the Lotso of Toy Story 3, you will likely feel the absence of what the Firewolf could have been and isn't quite. The concept is magnificent. The execution doesn't develop it far enough to produce the emotional resonance that the concept deserved. Its strong antagonists are critical to your enjoyment of animated adventure. That gap will cost you. If you are a purist about world-building logic, someone who needs the internal rules of a fictional universe to hold together completely under scrutiny, the pod mythology and the food chain mechanics of the valley will frustrate you because they don't hold up under the kind of detailed examination that dedicated world builders will inevitably apply. Now, how should you watch Swapped? This film was built for a screen large enough to do justice to its visual ambition. The valley deserves space. The cloud sequences deserve space. To do so deserve space. If you have any means of watching this on a larger screen than your phone, a television, a monitor, anything with enough real estate to let the valley's ecosystem fill your field of view, use it. Swapped is available on Netflix, which means it is accessible on virtually every screen you own. Choose the largest one. Kosla's score also deserves good speakers or headphones. The compositional details we discussed, the mirroring light motifs, the way the musical identities migrate between the swapped bodies are easiest to hear when the audio has room to breathe. Watch it in a single sitting if you can. The film's rhythm, despite its pacing problems, builds something cumulative that a paused and resumed slightly undercuts. The emotional architecture works better as a continuous experience, and if you have children watching with you, pause it at the end, not during the credits but immediately after the final image. The wide shot of the valley with both communities sharing space. Pause there and ask one question: what do you think happens next? Because the film has set up something it doesn't fully resolve, the ongoing imperfect generational work of building genuine connection across a history of manufactured fear, and the conversation that question opens is worth more than any additional streaming content you could put on afterward. Watch it twice. I am serious about this. The second watch of Swapped is materially different from the first, because you will see the Zoe in every scene where they appear, and you will understand what they are doing there, and the whole film will reorganize itself around that understanding into something more intentional and more layered than a first watch fully reveals. You will hear Ollie's musical theme in Ivy's scenes and Ivy's theme in Ollie's. You will see Boogle's sadness in the early scene where both communities ignore him. You will clock the firewolf's single moment of grief when Ollie asks it where it came from. A film that rewards a second watch is a film that has built more into itself than its surface requires. Swapped has done that. It does not always communicate it effectively in real time, but it is there, and finding it is its own reward. Own it? Not necessarily, not in the sense of purchasing a physical or permanent digital copy at premium price, unless you are a completist or a dedicated supporter of ambitious animation. Stream it. Stream it more than once. Recommend it to people who you think it will speak to. Let it find its audience the way it needs to, through word of mouth, through discovery, through the specific recommendation of a specific person who thought of a specific friend while thinking about what this film was doing. And here is my final thought before I close this box. There is a version of Swapped, the version the film was clearly reaching for, the version that exists in the negative space around the film we actually got, that would have been one of the great animated films of this decade. A film that gave the firewolf its full backstory. A film that let the second act breathe enough to earn every bit of the third. A film that paused at the moment Ollie and Ivy returned to themselves and let that pause be long and quiet and full of everything the journey had cost them and given them. A film that trusted its deus ex machina enough to set it up so clearly in the first act that no one could call it a deus ex machina in the third. That feel exists in the ingredients of Swapped. It was not fully assembled, and the distance between the film that exists and the film that almost existed is the distance that lives inside 5.8. But here is what I also believe, and what I think is the most honest and the most important thing I can say about Swapped as we close the box together. The scene where Ivy sits with Ollie's mother and receives, for the first time in her life, love she did not earn and did not perform for, that scene exists. It is in the film, it is real. It cannot be taken back by the pacing problems that surround it or the structural issues that frame it. That scene was made. Someone wrote it and someone directed it and Juno Temple performed it, and it is now permanently part of what this film is. And a film that contains a scene of that quality, that precision, that emotional truth, that quiet and radical insistence on the transformative power of ordinary human warmth is not a film you dismiss. It is a film you open, and that in the end is exactly what we did. Every film is a box, and we open this one together. And now, the final moment, the one where we step out of the valley, out of the analysis, out of every layer we have peeled back together over the course of this breakdown, and we simply sit here for a moment, the way you sit with someone after a long conversation that covered real ground, not rushing toward the door, not summarizing what was already said, just being present in what we built together before we go our separate ways. if you have been here for this entire breakdown, if you came in not knowing much about Swapped and you are leaving with a sense of its world, its ambitions, its achievements, its failures, its hidden details, its deepest themes, and the specific irreplaceable scene that makes it worth every minute of your time, then this has been exactly what the film box is for. This is what we do here. We don't skim, we don't summarize, we open. We go inside. We find what was hiding just beneath the surface, and we bring it back out into the light and hold it up and turn it around until we can see every facet of it. And Swapped, for all its imperfections, for all the structural frustrations and the pacing problems and the villain that deserved more and the ending that moved too fast. Swapped gave us a lot to find, a lot to hold up, a lot to turn around in the light that is not nothing. In a landscape full of films that offer you nothing to find beneath their surface, a film that hides things worth finding is a film worth the time of someone who loves film the way you do. Because that is who is here right now. Someone who loves film. Not casually, not as background noise, not as something to have on while you're doing something else, but genuinely. Someone who watches a film and wants to understand it. Someone who finishes a story and immediately wants to know more about how it was made, why it was made, what it was really trying to say, what it achieved, and what it fell short of, and why the falling short matters as much as the achievement. Someone who believes, as I believe, as this channel has always believed, that a film is not just entertainment, it is a box. And inside every box, if you are willing to open it carefully and look closely at what's inside, there is something that tells you something true about what it means to be alive in the world right now. That is why the film box exists. That is why we spend this kind of time on films. Not every film deserves this level of attention, but every film that genuinely tries, that reaches for something real, that puts something true inside even an imperfect box, that film deserves someone willing to sit with it long enough to find what it put there. Swap tried, Swap reached, and in his best moments, in that tunnel, in that mother's kitchen, in that long beat of silence where the firewolf almost remembers what it lost, Swapped found something real. We found it together. Now, I want to hear from you. If you have watched as Swapped, leave a comment below and tell me the moment that hit you hardest. Not your favorite scene necessarily, the moment that hit you hardest, the one that caught you off guard, the one that came from somewhere you weren't expecting, the one that stayed with you after you closed Netflix and went back to your regular life. Because every person who watches a film brings their own life to it, and the scene that lands deepest is different for everyone, and I genuinely want to know which one it was for you. Was it Ivy with Ollie's mother? Was it Boogle's specific quality of joy? Was it the firewolf's single moment of grief? Was it the cloud sequence, the tunnel, the valley's final white shot? Tell me. I will read every single comment. That is not something I say as a formula, it is something I mean. And if you have not watched Swapped yet, go watch it. Right now, tonight. You have everything you need to watch it with full context and genuine attention. You know how the box was built, you know what's inside it. Now go experience it for yourself in the order it was designed to be experienced, and then come back here and tell me whether what you felt matched what I described or whether you found something I missed. Because the most interesting thing that can happen after a breakdown like this one is not agreement. It is the comment that says, you talked about this scene this way, but here is what it meant to me. And it was something completely different. Those are the comments that make this channel worth making. Here is the discussion question I want to leave in the comment section. And I want you to take it seriously, because it is not a simple question and it does not have a simple answer. The film argues that the only true antidote to manufactured division is direct empathetic experience, that you cannot argue someone out of a fear that was not argued into them, that the only thing that works is genuine inhabitation of the other's truth. Do you believe that? In your own life, in the world you actually live in. Not the world of the valley, not the world of animated creatures made of bark and feather, but the specific world you navigate every single day. Do you believe that empathy at the scale the film is describing is actually possible? Or do you think the film is making an argument that is true and beautiful and ultimately too hopeful for the world as it actually works? That is the question. Leave your answer below and respond to each other's answers. Because the comment section of a film breakdown is one of the few places on the internet where a genuine conversation about something that matters can still happen between strangers who care about the same things. And I want this to be that kind of space, the way it has always been at the Film Box. Now, if this is your first time here and you made it all the way to the end of a breakdown this long, first of all, welcome. You have officially been inducted into the most dedicated corner of film analysis on this platform, and I am genuinely glad you are here. Hit the subscribe button. Not because subscribing to things is what you do at the end of YouTube videos as a reflex, but because if you spend this kind of time with this breakdown, what we do here is something you will want to come back to. We cover films this deeply every single time. Every genre, every era, every platform. New releases and forgotten classics and everything in between. If you love film the way this breakdown assumed you did, you belong here. And if you have been here before, if you are a regular at the Fin box, someone who has been opening boxes with us for a while, thank you. Genuinely, the fact that you keep coming back, that you trust us with your time in the way that watching a video this long requires, is something I never take for granted. This channel exists because you exist. Every breakdown we do is a conversation between us, between the film and the analysis and the person watching. And the quality of that conversation depends entirely on the quality of the people bringing themselves to it. You bring something real to it. That matters more than I can say. If you want to go deeper on animated film, if Swapped has made you want to spend time with other films in the genre that are doing ambitious things with familiar forms, I have some directions to point you in. Go back to Zootopia if you have not revisited it recently, because what that film does with its structural allegory holds up with extraordinary integrity under the kind of close attention we brought to Swapped today. Go to Tangled, specifically to appreciate what Nathan Greno's directorial sensibility looked like when it had the full resources of Disney animation behind it, and compare that to what you see in Swapped, and think about what changed and what stayed the same and what that tells you about a filmmaker's core preoccupations versus the conditions that shape how those preoccupations get expressed. Go to the Sea Beast, which is another Skydance adjacent Netflix animated feature that demonstrates what this corner of the streaming animation world is genuinely capable of when everything aligns. And go to whatever animated film you haven't seen yet, that someone whose taste you trust has been telling you to watch. Because the best recommendation is always a personal one, and the best film is always the next one you haven't seen. Now, the next video, we are going somewhere very different from the valley next time. We are stepping out of animation entirely, out of magical pods and bark-carved creatures and walking forests, and into something much more grounded, much more human, and in some ways much more unsettling. The next box we open is a film that arrived with significant critical attention and left audiences more divided than almost anything released in its window. A film that asks questions about memory and identity that does not have a comfortable answer, and that is willing to sit in the discomfort of that question for its entire runtime without flinching. I am not going to tell you the title yet, but I am going to tell you that if you found the empathy themes in Swapped interesting, if the idea of inhabiting another's experience in order to truly understand it resonated with you, the next breakdown is going to hit you from a completely unexpected angle on exactly that idea. Be here for it. It is going to be worth the time. And if there is a film you want us to open at the film box, a title you have been sitting with, a story you want broken down the way we break things down here, something you watched and felt like you understood only the surface of and wanted someone to go deeper with you, leave it in the comments. With every suggestion, we keep a list, and the films that keep coming up, the ones that the community keeps asking for, those are the ones that move to the top. because this channel has always been built on the same thing it was built on from the very first video, the belief that the right conversation about the right film with the right level of care and attention and genuine love for the form is one of the great pleasures available to a person who cares about stories. We are not here to be first. We are not here to be loudest. We are here to be deepest. That is the film box. That has always been the film box. And as long as you keep showing up ready to go deeper, we will keep being here to take you there. Alright, the box is closed. Swapped. 5.8 out of 10. A film made of extraordinary ingredients that does not always find the architecture to hold them at their best. A film with a scene, that quiet, stolen, unearned moment of belonging in a mother's company that belongs in any honest conversation about what animated film can achieve at the level of emotional truth. A film that is worth your time, worth your attention, worth your conversation. A film that tried, in a world where so many films don't even do that. A film that genuinely, visibly, ambitiously tried is worth something real. Go watch it. Come back and tell me what you found. Every film is a box, and we've only just started opening them. That's the film box. See you in the next one.